Hi, and welcome to another episode of About the Authors TV Britain Edition. I'm your host, Jake Brown. The fictional worlds of Menna von Praag have often whispered with the voices of the fantastic. The Guardian once wrote of the author with a special gift for weaving magic realism into stories that co-star her hometown of Cambridge so vividly that as the reader you feel like a tourist in the pages of her stories. Starting years ago with her first novella, Men, Money, and Chocolate, was published into 26 languages around the world, and its sequel, Happier Than She's Ever Been. Van Praag began to expand her spell weaving into full-length novels like The House at the End of Hope Street, which Compulsive Reader praised as a delightful one-of-a-kind book. Fans were next invited into the dress shop of dreams, where the New York Journal of Books observed that she has a deliciously innate capability to weave the totality of characters into a compelling tale, and continued doing so with The Witches of Cambridge. The Lost Letters of Art Writing, which the Romantic Times found not surprisingly was filled with magic, love, and the bonds of family. The thoroughly engaging book will whisk any reader away to a place where anything is possible, and the patron saints of lost souls. Enchanting her readers more recently with the Sisters Grimm trilogy, which took flight with the Sisters Grimm, where Publishers Weekly found Von Praag braids mystery, magic, and a vicious hunt for power into a dark, delicious story through entrancing prose. Readers will be drawn to these well-developed characters in their lush world. Promising more with the recently released sequel, The Night of Demons and Saints, and the forthcoming Child of Earth and Sky. It's a concept that sounds like something right out of a cartoon. A magic bus filled with books that drove through town when they were children, bringing new adventures to escape into each week. Was that your experience when you were young and growing up in Britain?
We had a book library as well that would go around from place to place. But I very distinctly remember the first solid library that I went into, and it was just around the corner, actually from where I live now, because I've moved around and I'm back in my hometown. And I remember very distinctly the smell of it. And I remember, I mean, back in the day, we're talking about the 1980s here, they had all of the card catalogs, where they had the books written out. And I think that made me a real, like, I'm very old fashioned. I'm not into technology so much. So all of my books are all about that. I guess it's nostalgia in a way for that time. When you would go into a library and you get your book stamped and they'd put it on the card catalog and they'd put it, you had your name and they'd put all the books and you knew what you'd read. And so libraries feature hugely in my books and bookshops because I think, don't you most authors love these places? It's like there are like our churches.
Beautifully put, they very much are. And libraries, by that analogy, are cathedrals by the time you're studying at Oxford University and had access to their book wonderland, I'd have to imagine.
Yes. When I was at Oxford, the most magnificent library I went into was the Bodleian Library, and it was incredible. And I studied history, so there was a lot of historical manuscripts there and so on. And there was a librarian there called Elizabeth, and she was so lovely that I just fell in love with her. And she then starred in my first novel. I just remembered so strongly her, I didn't use her name, but her essence, just the very essence of her. And there was a library that starred in that novel. And yeah, I carried her with me for sort of a decade after that, because I would always request the books from her and we would talk about books, and she was a kindred spirit. At Oxford, we don't have majors and minors like you have in America. So you're only allowed to do one thing, which is a bit frustrating in a way because I wanted to do so many things, but you had to pick the one thing. And I didn't pick English literature because there was a lot of very old literature. So there was Beowulf and all of that. And I just thought, I don't know, it wasn't for me. And I thought, well, history is stories. History is essentially made up stories because you can just pick one angle and tell it from that angle, or you pick that angle and you tell, you can write a completely conflicting story. So I thought, and then history is such a huge part of the books that I love to read and the books that I write as well. So, that really imbued me. But funnily enough, there was a particularly scary professor at Oxford called Dr. Skinner, and he has featured in several of my novels.
I understand a fellow author who we're proud to count as a guest, Alice Hoffman, also had a big influence on you during this era.
Well, it's funny, just as an aside that you mentioned Alice Hoffman, because I had a huge crush on Alice Hoffman. And when I was writing my thesis at Oxford, I actually all summer, I discovered her that summer. So the summer of 97 or something. And I would spend, all day in the Bodleian doing my research. And then I would sneak out at lunchtime and go and read Alice Hoffman books in the local borders, very naughtily, kind of like this. Because I was a student, I couldn't afford to buy them, I subsequently bought them all, just in case Alice is worried about that. But yes, I think the first books that set me on magical realism vibe was The House of the Spirits by Isabel Allende, that I remember made a huge impact on me. And I just never knew books could be written like that. And of course, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, that hit me too. On another side of the genre was Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. That hit me very hard as well. And I always think that the books that you read as a teenager, when you're really open and really just like ready to be imprinted on, are the books that you carry with you for the rest of your life.
When you were reading as a teenager and the way that made you feel, does that affect you now as a writer in terms of how you want the teen reader to feel?
Definitely, definitely. I mean, those books in particular, I would say. So The House at the End of Hope Street, I even brought back Du Maurier's ghost as a character. And I teach creative writing a lot, and I reference them all the time. And I do think, I don't think I will ever achieve those heights in a way of the astonishingness of those books. But there are, I hope, moments, that you feel that you thought, yes, that's exactly what I was trying to achieve in that moment. And I feel very satisfied about that.
I have to imagine you drew autobiographically on your own work as a waitress, at the time aspiring to be a writer, as you worked on your first published novella, Men, Money, and Chocolate.
Strangely, then life imitated art in a weird twist. So for the first iteration, so I finished Oxford, I graduated, I was supposed to get a real job. I didn't want to get a real job because it just wasn't in me to sit in an office all day. I really wanted to publish a novel, and I thought, rightly it turned out, because I did experience a little bit of office work, that would just kill my brain. And I thought waitressing will work because it's essentially mindless, it's mainly physical. And I would spend, hours just kind of, when there was a dull period or something, I would be writing little stories on napkins, on my little pad that I was taking orders on, and that kind of thing. And I met my husband, then boyfriend, very early in life. It was kind of a passionate romance. We were only 19. And I said to him when I graduated, I was like, I don't want to do the traditional, I don't want to get a house and a job and kids and all that until I've published a book. And, that was my goal, because I thought otherwise all of those things are going to set me off track. And I meet so many people and they say, I really want to write a novel. And I say, have you written a novel? And they're like, no, I have no time, because life takes over. So I was like, right, life is on hold until. So then I said, I'll give myself a deadline when I'm 30. If I haven't published anything 10 years, then obviously I'm no good and we can give it up and I'll get a real job. So I did the usual thing where you're writing, you're sending it off. I mean, in those years, you were sending actual manuscripts off. You had to photocopy them and they came back rejected in a big envelope, and it was all very depressing in a slightly different way than emails. And I was 29 by this point of lots of rejection. I had the Stephen King thing, when he nails the stake to the wall and then it falls off because there's so many rejections. And yeah, so it was 3 months before my 30th birthday. And I freaked out because I'm like, my God, I gave myself this deadline. My husband's saying, right, okay, now time to live the life, And so I took 2 weeks off work, waitressing, and I wrote that novella in those 2 weeks. Now it's pretty short. It's only 35,000 words. But it was easy to write because it was completely autobiographical. I'm miserable, I really want to get published, etc., etc. But in the last third of the book, what the character does, because she can't get published, is she self-publishes, and then she kind of makes a name for herself that way, and then she gets, picked up by a publisher.
And well before it was translated into 26 languages around the world. That's precisely what you did. Please share with viewers and the aspiring author watching about how you pulled that off. It's a great story of determination.
I wrote the book and I sent it out And again, it got rejected. And I was like, oh man, this was like my last shot kind of thing. And then my mom, who's a life coach, she said to me, well, now you just have to do what your main character did and self-publish your book. I was like, I'm not doing that, because back in the day, kind of what we're talking 15 years ago, it's not like it is today. You can't just upload something onto Amazon and there it is. You had to invest. You had to print out all those copies. You have to take them to Borders and to all the shops and say, please, will you put my book in your store, right? And I think a lot of authors are like this, especially when I was younger. I was very nervous. I was an introvert. We don't want to go out there and sell ourselves. We want our editors, and publicists to do that for us. And it was awful. It was absolutely awful. And I would go around and I did things like, because there were some recipes in the book, and we have this thing here called chocolate flapjacks, which are made of oats and butter and chocolate and made golden syrup. And I would make batches of these and I would take them to bookstores and say, please, will you put my book in the window? Have some chocolate flapjacks, And by about sort of 10 months in, I'd sold 1,000 copies, which for that time was a lot. And I sent the book back to the same publishing company that had rejected it, because there was only, because it's a novella and so on, there was only not many that would take it. And it was so funny because I hadn't changed a single word of it, but they knew that I'd sold 1,000 copies of it. And suddenly they loved the book. And that was really interesting. I always tell my students this: rejection doesn't necessarily mean that there's anything wrong with the book. It was the exact same book, but then they could see money potential in it. And then within 6 months, they had sold it within 26 territories. I just thought, wow, thanks. That proves it. So it was 10 years and then boom.
By the time you sat down to begin writing the sequel, happier than she's ever been, were you with the state of your own career now that you'd been published?
Well, the satisfaction there also was that my editor said, I said, I want to write a sequel. My editor said, no, we don't want a sequel. We want something different. And then I was like, no, I really think a sequel will be better. And then I spent a year sort of writing something. They didn't want it. I would write something else. No, this isn't right. This isn't right. And after about a year, they said, okay, write the sequel. And then I wrote the sequel. And they were like, yeah, it's great. We love it. And I went, yeah. Yes, I didn't have an agent because, I don't know. I hadn't managed to get one. And with that, I think I knew the publishing company that would take it if anyone would. And that was Hay House, because it was, slightly spiritual little novellas, so on. And so I did the second book with them. And then after that, I tried to get an agent. I had been trying before that. And then I remember loads of agents turned me down, and they were saying, but you have to write a proper novel. And so after that, after I picked myself up off the floor, that was when I then spent years writing something that was more literary, and it was magical realism, but it was much more literary, and it was a full-length novel.
Here, of course, we're talking about The House at the End of Hope Street. An inspired sojourn from the first page onward, Compulsive Reader found that Von Praag has successfully set the tone for a warm, comforting, inviting place where you can literally be anything you want to be, and anything can happen at the moment. The book is a bit of everything: romance and unrequited love, mystery, and a very strong sense of sisterhood and friendship. The reader gets the sense that these women deserve some magic in their lives. Please talk about the magic ensemble cast you created here between your characters like Alba, Peggy, and the real-life writers like Virginia Woolf, Dorothy Parker, and Agatha Christie that you populate the house and story with. And is there a real house like this one on Hope Street?
Thank you. So Hope Street is really almost around the corner from where I live. And I will have seen it a lot as a child, and it was just kind of in there in my subconscious. And I had this, obviously it's a metaphor for Hope Street. And I had this idea of a magical, enormous house, which actually came from a fantasy of mine, whereby I thought, I would like to be really, really rich. And then I would buy a house, and then artists could live there. And they would live there for 6 months or a year, enough for them to get going. Because I think it's really hard for writers and artists and actors and so on. You're doing a full-time job because you've got to pay the rent, and then you're trying to do your creative work as well. And it's really, really challenging when you're starting out. So I had that idea, and then I thought, well, I'll create that in fiction. And so there's this house, and it attracts people who need it. And so you're, wandering around Cambridge, you're lost, and something awful's happened to you, and you find yourself on the doorstep of Hope Street. And Peggy was a little bit inspired by Mrs. Madrigal from Amsden Morpen, Tales of the City. And I just love this idea of having this wonderful landlady who would take everyone in, but then to give it a magical edge, so that the rooms adapt to you and they provide you what you need. So then you have many characters in there. So you have a writer, you have a singer, you have a painter, you have all of these people. And then it's also imbued with all the ghosts of the past people who've been there. And again, the history, you see, there's always an element of history. And I had to really know their voices. So I would do a lot of research in terms of their writing. And sometimes I would use lines that they actually said, and then I would write around that as well. And I just thought, I wanted it to have a primarily English base. So obviously, we had Dorothy Parker and so on. I bring in the most wonderful writers, but I wanted them, my idea was that they all should have been able to have visited Cambridge at some point. So I really enjoyed playing around with Agatha Christie, because she, famously disappeared for 11 days and nobody knows where she went or what she did. And it's this sort of great mystery here. And we speculate endlessly about what happened. And I thought, well, maybe she went to Hope Street, so there was all these little links. I wanted that bit to be believable. And then I would just choose my favorites and people who are wonderful with words, verbally as well as on the page. And I just go to her whenever I'm struggling with anything. So she has that energy. And then I would just imbue her with the energy of all the women that I've known who've been, authority figures in my life. Like you mentioned the English teacher earlier, the first person who said to me, you could be a writer at 17 years old. She was in there too, all of those older women who have that energy. And I myself aspire to be Peggy when I'm 80. That's my that's my ambition in life.
As you did with this one, you've long set the majority of your books in your beloved hometown of Cambridge. Why have you felt such loyalty setting nearly all of them there throughout your career, where you could have traveled anywhere you wish with these characters?
I grew up in Cambridge. I love Cambridge. I was at Oxford for 5 years. And while Oxford has kind of this otherworldly charm, I mean, Oxford was established before Cambridge was, so it actually has older buildings. The college I went to, Balliol, was established in 1215. And it's amazing because, I have a lot of American friends, and when they come here to visit, they just can't believe it. They're like, 1215? What? It's really interesting. And I love that. I love the history. I love knowing that the street that I'm walking down was walked on by the Georgians, the Victorians, the, medieval people. It's the richness of that. It imbues everything with layers, quite apart from the fact that the architecture is absolutely beautiful. And I think it lends itself particularly to magical realism and fantasy, because it's not much of a step. If you're in some kind of industrial place, it's a little bit more of a step to go into something magical. But when you're walking down a street that's 1,000 years old and there's beautiful turrets and chimneys rising high into the sky, like, yeah, this place is pretty magical. And so it was a bit of a no-brainer for me.
You'd next invite readers for a visit inside the Dress Shop of Dreams, where the New York Journal of Books would observe early on that you had a deliciously innate capability to weave the totality of characters of the Dress Shop of Dreams into a compelling tale. Each character from Cambridge to Oxford augments and refines these dynamics. Ultimately, von Praag cracks the code that deciphers magical fate when it comes to couture and the complexities of love. For Walt, Cora, Sparks, and her grandmother Etta, please talk a bit about how you first wove that fateful spell that affects them all together as you were writing.
I think a lot of it is unconscious, so it's sort of impossible to answer. But I think a lot of that comes from the setting, actually. I'm a huge believer in atmosphere. And I think that's why also I love Daphne du Maurier, because you're talking about Cambridge as a setting. And this is Cornwall. And she created a sense of atmosphere so superbly that it was almost as if everything else came from that. And for me, that's the same. It's Cambridge is magical to me. So it's really not a leap that when you're completely immersed in that, the magic comes from it. It's, as you said, it's a character in itself. That was inspired as well by the place. So there's a little street in Cambridge called All Saints Passage, and I think it's been there for 800 years or something. And there was a little tailor's on that street. It's no longer there, but it was, it's a magical street, and it's a street that you kind of wander down accidentally and you don't know, oh, look, well, here I am. It's got trees, hanging over it and all of that kind of thing. And I thought, for me, there's one idea that manufactures, inspires a book. And this was the idea that sometimes when you put on a certain type of clothing, you feel that you've transformed, you're someone else entirely. And I think that comes from actors a lot, that they'll put on their costume and they'll be someone else. And so I wanted to take that idea, but make it again a little bit magical. So the proprietor of the shop, she does a little stitch in the dress, and that's what, makes it transform. And one of the other characters, he was inspired by a story my mom told me about the cigar rollers in Cuba, how they employ people, they give a little bit of money from their wages and employ people to read to them while they're rolling their cigars. And I just thought, that's so romantic, that idea, And then we have Radio 4 here, and they have something called a book at bedtime. So I merged those two ideas, and it would be someone who had a magical voice who would read the book at bedtime. And then they would, he would enchant people and so on and so forth.
Now, I'm not sure if your hometown has any local lore of sorcerers hiding in plain sight, as they are here in the Witches of Cambridge. Please introduce us to the circle of Amadine Bassett, Noah, Cassima, and others who compose the Cambridge University Society of Literature and Witchcraft.
I don't know about you, but all of my books are inspired by one little idea. Someone tells me this one idea and it's so exciting, I can run with that. And that idea was, someone said to me, we don't look up much. We live in this beautiful, beautiful place, and we see all of the architecture and we see how beautiful it is, but we don't look up and see the turrets. And she said, imagine if there were witches up there. And we had this mad idea of like a book group of witches, and they would meet on the top of, Trinity College Tower because they could, and it would give them great views. And that idea, and then all the students and the rest of us would be walking around beneath and we wouldn't see them. So there was that one idea. And I thought, and of course, the Witches of Eastwick is one of, a great favorite of mine. So I thought, the Witches of Cambridge, a little nod, And again, the atmosphere in that place is fantastic. So there was that idea. And then all of the characters came from that. And I think, as you probably realize, that there's a lot of mothering in the books. There's always that wise woman figure in there. And she might be struggling herself, but there's always someone who will inspire someone else. And that sense of community and friendship. And I'm going to have dinner at Magdalen College in a couple of weeks and meet a professor of witches, because she read The Witches of Cambridge. And she said, we can talk about, she studies it from a literature point of view. But, I've always loved the idea of witches, that magical element. And I do find, I know it sounds really, to some writers, it sounds really silly. And some writers say, yeah, that happens to me. Absolutely. They start talking. I just feel, and whether that's some kind of weird alchemy, or whether that's just that you've created them so vividly in your mind that, you make them start to talk. But one thing I absolutely love in writing is when a character takes a scene in a different direction. So you start with something and where you want to get to at the end of that scene, but they start talking in a different way. And in a way, they're telling you, well, I wouldn't say that, I wouldn't do that. And I really explore my character. So for me, I mean, sometimes I have favorites, but they all have to feel equally real to me. So they all have to have that element of magicalness, but also realism. So that for me is why I love both of those things. They have to feel so grounded in reality that I would believe them to be real people. And of course, you have your soft spots for the ones that you create maybe most vividly, or that you want to exist in real life so that you could be friends with them. That sometimes happens, or that you fall in love with them a bit because they're so, the male characters for me. So yeah.
There's times you actually fall in love with your male romantic leads?
Well, because what I used to do in my younger days, pre-kids, I would make collages. So I would pick, because I always write about real places in Cambridge. And then I would have the photographs of those real places, so I'm there and it's on my writing desk and I'm seeing that. And then I would choose actors who I, would pick, and they would be the character. And then I would discover that there was often a sort of the main male character would be an actor who I found particularly attractive. And then, I'm writing about him and there he is staring at me every day, so that helped things along a bit.
Great tip. The Romantic Times would find that the lost art of letter writing, not surprisingly, filled with magic, love, and the bonds of family, guaranteeing readers that the thoroughly engaging book will whisk anyone away to a place where anything's possible. Talk a bit, if you would, about how that all began with Clara Cohen discovering a stash of love letters written during a long ago war.
I kind of think that all writers are nosy, essentially, right? We just, we eavesdrop on people, we're essentially curious. And to me, the kind of gold dust of writing would be to find some unopened some letters in an attic somewhere. And I just be like, oh my God, where are these from? And who wrote them? And that to me was a really huge fantasy. It also came from the fact that one of my best friends said, oh, we should open a stationery shop. Because as I said, I'm super old fashioned and I love letter writing. I just love it. I love getting letters. I love writing letters. I have here on my desk absolutely dozens of little inks. I have all of these inks and they're so, so beautiful. And I love stationery shops almost as much as bookshops, but not quite. So I thought, well, I can't open a stationery shop because it would probably fail, it would be challenging, but I can write about one and then I can live in it for that year that I'm writing that book. And then I also had a bit of gold dust from family history, because my grandparents' family were Jewish and most of them came over before during early Second World War. But my great aunt was hidden like Anne Frank when she was only 14. And she met her husband when she was 14 and he was hidden as well. And so throughout the war, they didn't see each other this whole time. Obviously, they were both Jewish and they were both hidden from the Nazis. And then they met afterwards and they married, and 60 years, 70 years until she died. And then he died a bit later, in their 90s. I mean, it was just incredible. And because it was my family, it was even more magical. Yeah, beautiful. And I went to Amsterdam for my honeymoon, and Amsterdam, I mean, my God, it's like Cambridge in terms of all these little tiny streets, and they have an incredible stationery store there. And so that was, again, a gift to a writer. And I thought, well, I've always wanted to write that family story and give it that magical twist. And I thought, well, now's the time.
What a beautiful love story. Within the pages of your next bestseller, The Patron Saint of Lost Souls, readers walk into a very special Cambridge antique shop. And what a perfect place to start a book. Is this based on one real shop or a collection of many?
It's an amalgam of a few, I think. So we have some lovely antique shops here, and I'm like you, I will always go into an antique shop. I won't usually buy much, although it made my day yesterday because I found an old door with stained glass in it, and it was only £40. I was like, right, that door is mine. So I love antique stores, and it just, I don't know where that idea came from actually, but the idea that there would be some kind of magical trinket little talisman that you would take and it would change your life in some way. So as you can see, all of the locations are kind of old fashioned, and they, have that element of magic to them. But that again came from, and I set it on Green Street, which is another magical street in Cambridge. And I just thought, endlessly you could write about Cambridge, because I always write about certain colleges and professors at those colleges.
Using Viola and Jude's romance as an example for the aspiring author, what needed to be there for you between them for the romance to work that might apply generally to that aspect of the craft?
For me, I think it's that it's not just incidental. It's not just a romance. I think that's what makes it slightly different from a book that is a romance, is that my books usually have romantic elements, but they're not about you meeting someone. It comes from your own, I always have, the central theme for me is always the character arc of the transformation of someone. And it's usually someone who's shy and they don't feel good about themselves and they don't know how to get what they want. And then they transform and they become confident and they become empowered and all of that. And then incidentally to that, they might discover that they, experience a romance, but that's not what propels them. It's always essentially, in a way, a coming of age, no matter what age the characters are. But it's that they have to discover something within themselves. Those are the stories that I love more than any other. Those are the films that I love more than any other. There's some flaw in the character and they have to reconcile that by the end of the novel. And that's what I love. And if they find love along the way, then great.
With that book title too, who would have thought it wasn't taken already and there it was just waiting for you?
Right? When that happens, it is a bit magical, isn't it? When those titles come to you, and you just think, oh, thank you.
The Sisters Grimm found familiar comfort set in the heart of your cherished hometown, the Cambridge Independent, would discover as they set out on a tour de force of fairy tale and imagination. A magic tale of life, death, and sisterhood, shot through a spectacular, sometimes near hallucinogenic sense of fear, wonder, and hope. Within Sisters, Goldie, Liana, Scarlet, and Bea's story, The Guardian would find it refreshing that von Praag attempts to examine the traumatic histories, bereavement, abuse, and feelings of alienation. What first led you to set these siblings out on this 33-day journey, to rediscover their elemental powers and use them to survive the coming storm?
That came primarily when my daughter was born, actually, because two things happened. One, she was a girl, and so I started thinking a lot more about, because often I write about older women, and I started thinking a lot more about younger women and how they become older women and all of the generations of women. And I was thinking a lot about the stories that we tell our daughters, especially. So obviously fairy tales. And I'm quite, I have certain issues with fairy tales and, how they're teaching women to be women and not the most proactive ways. And so I really thought, right, I want to write for her some stories. I want to write empowering stories that are not about princesses who want to find princes, stories that are about women becoming themselves independently and so on. And that was where the idea came from her birth. The other thing that happened was I did not sleep at all. So there was these two things combined. So I would be awake, most of the night. And I remember when my editor at Penguin bought the book, he said, this book has a kind of hallucinogenic quality to it. And I said, yeah, that's because I was on drugs, I was awake all the time. So I would mainly write between sort of 3 and 4 a.m. and I would write these stories. And I remember kind of just being up and I would write these stories in my head because I didn't, I was breastfeeding or whatever, and I didn't have paper. And then I would, sketch them down in the morning. And it evolved from that. So there are a lot of short stories in these books, in the trilogy of the Sisters Grimm, because it came from that impetus to rewrite. And of course, people are doing that enormously now. There's so many retellings of fairy tales and myths, especially. So a bit of a zeitgeisty thing, it just happened. It wasn't really big when I was doing that. Although I did love Angela Carter and she was writing in the 70s. So that was where that came from. And then the idea of the Sisters Grimm came from the thought of the Brothers Grimm and how they really appropriated a lot of stories. You know, they didn't write them, they took them from oral stories that were often told by women, and then they put them together. And I thought, so, I kind of had them as not such, good characters, because they're, a little bit devilish in that way. And then I thought, well, but they're the father of all of these fairy tale characters. And then these fairy tale characters are sisters. And then I thought, well, what about if they're living in the real world and they don't realize who they are and that they're connected to each other. So then it became about finding each other. And it was inspired also by my two great books that I loved as a child, which is The Chronicles of Narnia and Alice in Wonderland. Yeah, it was really fun. I really wanted to, so they each, as you say, have one of the four elements. So I added that in, so they were the fairy tale characters, but they also imbued one of the elements. So Goldilocks came first, Goldie, and she is Earth. And so she can control, make things grow, and she can heal things and so on. And the idea behind the sort of Alice in Wonderland thing is that when they're very young, they can go into this place everywhere and they can express their magical powers and their control of the elements. But then, of course, when they become teenagers, they forget, they get enmeshed in the real world. And then they're 18 and they're trying to discover each other and themselves, because little things are coming back to them and they don't quite understand what's going on. So Goldie was, very grounded and very earthy. And I loved the little kind of fairy tale nods. So she's working in a hotel and she's a thief, because Goldilocks essentially is a thief, and she's, sleeping on the beds and stealing things for her little brother and so on. And then Liana was controlled. She's a water element. So as a daughter, as a child, she would, make it rain and do all of these kinds of things. And then as an adult, she swims, she's always swimming. So it's like she doesn't know what she can do, but she's still drawn to that thing. And that was really a metaphor for me about how we're so open and expressive when we're children, and then we can often forget that as adults. And then if we're lucky, we rediscover, those things that we really loved. And so she was Snow White, but her name is in Zulu. So I was sort of playing around with that. And then B, she's Spanish, and she is air. And so in this iteration of her life, she loves to fly planes. So she's at Cambridge University and she's in and she does wild things in planes and nearly kills herself and other people and so on, because she also doesn't, remember. And Scarlet is Red Riding Hood, so then I was playing around with, she actually has a grandmother in the story. And then her grandmother owns one of the most famous cafes in Cambridge, which overlooks King's College, and she has that kind of fire. She's fire, and she has that element. So she bakes a lot, because it has that link to fire, and she can sort of heat up toast with her hands and that kind of thing. Yeah, I felt that because I was delving into so much, and there was so much richness there in a way, and I could have gone into the atmosphere enchanted me very much. And I'm not so heavily plot driven, so I need to be more plot driven. So I often give myself these artificial elements so that I make sure the story keeps going forward. Because I think, especially in this day and age, I'm always saying to my students, you've got to think about plot, because you've got Netflix and you've got all of these things that are drawing a reader away from your book. Goodness, Charles Dickens didn't have to worry about that. He can put out these long, huge books and they meander. Dickens meanders so much, and I love that meandering as a reader, but I think a lot of readers nowadays, they want that. They want the pace. They want the momentum. If you have that ticking clock element, I think it works really well.
The Night of Demons and Saints picks up in a less than enviable position, to say the least, for the sisters, giving fans who bought what Library Journal reported was a 50,000 copy first printing a real bang for their buck. Before all that, when you were writing the first book, did you know already you'd be picking up from there 3 years later, approaching the consequential night of their 21st birthday?
That's what I did, because I'd never written a trilogy before. I didn't actually intend to sell it as a trilogy. I wrote the Sisters Grimm as a standalone. And it was my canny agent who said, oh, let's try and sell this as a trilogy. And I said, well, okay. So then I came up with some ideas for books 1 and 2. But I mean, as you know, the lag in publishing is huge. So it was 18 months between selling book coming out, possibly closer to 2 years, actually, in this case. And I thought, I'm never going to remember, because I'm so in the moment when I'm writing a book. And I think a lot of authors say this, that you then forget all the other books that you've ever written, right? That is the book that you're writing. And it's like, who knows what happened before? And I thought, that's going to happen. I cannot pick this up in a year or 18 months. Plus you have to do loads of promo and there's all of that kind of thing. So you're not in that space either. So I just wrote them. I just wrote the second and the third straight away as soon as I could, so that I still knew what everyone was doing. I mean, with Night of Demons and Saints, I wanted to explore storytelling more in it. And I brought, not to spoil the plot, but one sister goes, so but there's still the ghostly presence, because I like exploring that idea. There's often ghosts in the book, so that there's no death. There is death, but there's no death. And just that idea of sisterhood and stretching them, because oftentimes in a standalone, you can take someone from one place, with their big flaw, and then they've become empowered at the end and they feel ready to do anything. And it's a bit like those romances where they end, the couple gets together and then what, so there was that idea of, well, what would happen to them? They've had this empowerment, but then what if life kicks them down again? How are they going to cope with that? Are they going to have the strength to do that? But what if they've lost touch with each other again? What are the elements that they're struggling with, and how are they going to cope? So I addressed sort of darker subject matter in the second one. So there was a lot about grief and parenting unruly teenagers, and dealing with poverty and rejection and heartbreak. So I wanted to, I suppose, put them, torture them a bit more. I'm always saying that to my students as well. It's like, you have your main character, you make them suffer. That's your story. That's how you can get your plot. So that really interested me.
Now, what can fans of the series look forward to when they catch up next with the Spellbound siblings and the upcoming sure-to-be bestseller, Child of Earth and Sky?
For the third book, Child of Earth and Sky, I wanted to take the youngest one. Then there's a new generation. So they're all growing up and there's a new generation. And then she becomes something of a vigilante. So then I'm looking at what is good and what is bad. And there was a little bit influence of Dexter in there, I suppose, thinking about it, sort of punishment and how. So I think there's a lot of themes that I use, themes that I really care about, that I will explore within my characters' worlds.
Well, you do it with quite an imagination. Beyond the next book in the series, are you looking forward to returning to the world of standalones?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, again, this might become a series, but I'm working on my first middle grade, which is a completely different thing. And I actually had to get another agent who specializes in children's books. And she's taught me so much. But it's because my children are growing up and they really want to read my books. And I'm like, you cannot read my books, then no way. So I thought, well, I'm really interested to write. And it's a very fresh challenge, because writing for children is a completely different thing. I find myself wanting to indulge in very vivid description and, make it really lush. And there's so much world building. And my agent says, no. Cut, story. And I think, oh, okay. So I like that writing, teaching, it all meshes together, and that we're always learning. I mean, that's why I always want to give myself fresh challenges, because otherwise, what's the point?
I have to imagine being an active author makes you that much better of a teacher of young writing minds at Cambridge University. Whether during your time at Cambridge University's Institute of Continuing Education, and then the Cambridge School of Drama and the Creative Arts, or Anglia Ruskin University, better known as ARU, and of course as a Royal Literary Fund Fellow. Please make us your class for a second and share a little wisdom if you would.
The one that I just think is more important than any other is that when you're in a project, I don't mean just all the time, because I think that could be impossible for some people, but when you're in a project, you have to write every single day. And that sounds so simple, but people don't, if they don't follow it. And I've had so many students say to me, oh yeah. And then they'll email me and say, yeah, you're actually right about that, because I'm writing this and I took a couple of days off. And I think, to me, you've got to be so immersed in the world. And if you take time off and you get yourself out of that, it's so much harder to get back into it. And I think writers, in a way, make for horrible partners, because we're so in the world, and my husband will always know when I'm working on a new book, because he's like, you're not really here right now, are you? At the dinner table, you're kind of in your magical world, because we're always linking in. Agatha Christie said the best time to plot a book is while doing the dishes. And I think, it just shows that writers are always thinking, we're always in the shower. I get great ideas in the shower and I have to quickly, write them down or take a voicemail on my phone. And we just all the time. And that to me is essential when you're in a project, because you take a week off and it's like, then you're kind of, doing it by numbers. It's not authentic. It's not real. You've lost touch with this world. This world has to be to your reader as real as the world that they're living in. I mean, to me, the most enchanting books are when I'm in the book and I forget that I'm reading a book. If you can do that to a reader, that is magic, because you are reading a book. I mean, it's so much harder to lose yourself in a book in a way than in a film or a song, because you've got to go through that, and you're, in a way, you want to bypass the head and go straight to the heart. And that is, to me, the writer's challenge, because you're doing that through the realm of words. And how do you do that? Because they are thinking, and you want them to, in a way, stop thinking and not be questioning it. It's like when you're watching a film and you know that they're acting. And great films are when you forget that they're acting. If you can forget that that's Meryl Streep, and you're just there with that person, and that person just is the person in the film, that's brilliant. That's worked really well. If you're watching it and thinking, oh, that's really good acting, hasn't really worked, because you're still analyzing it.
That's a wonderful point. How do you get yourself so into the writing that you forget you're writing?
Yes, that to me is the ultimate experience of writing. And it only comes when you keep doing it and you keep doing it. And often, I mean, you mentioned Joyce Carol Oates. She has a great quotation, and she says something like, you can't wait for moods. You have to get to work. And she said something like, even when my soul was as thin as a playing card, I sat down to write. And then she says something like, the writing creates the mood. I think amateur writers wait for the muse. They wait to feel inspired. And that's never going to happen. You're never going to finish a novel. Professional writers sit down every day and they write. And half the time, it doesn't work. It's rubbish, and you're like, oh my God, that was another 3 hours wasted. But it's not wasted, because you had to get through that dross. So often you get through, 1,000 words and it's rubbish, and you're going to delete it. But then comes a paragraph of brilliance. But you can't just get to that paragraph of brilliance. And I think that's what people don't necessarily understand. They think, oh, I can just write a brilliant novel. No, being a writer means being an editor. Being a writer means sitting down. I think it was Dorothy Parker that said, writing is the art of applying the arse to the seat. You have to sit down and do it. It's not glamorous always. It's not. But then you get those moments where you forget that you're writing. You're writing, your characters are speaking to you. And it just sort of takes on a life of its own. And you're like, oh my God, well, who's writing this? Because it's not me. And that's why I do it.
Menna, it's been so much fun talking today. Thanks for taking our time to be on About the Authors TV.
Thank you so much.